So the French Revolution itself would have been a major turning point in history. It is one of the major stepping stones, right, of persons or of the world itself stepping into a period of pure enlightenment and political and ideological change. The French Revolution is that important, right? The French Revolution now, right? We have known what happened within France, right? We know the things that were plaguing the French citizens, right? For them to actually rise up in such a violent manner, right? To now attack monarchy itself, right? We're gonna be looking at some of those causes, right? So, firstly, the ancien regime, right, the ancient regime, right, had some amount of they had peculiar measures, right, of really separating the French people and having their own assembly specifically, right? And we know what the assembly did, right? What happened in this case? We had three different estates existing within France, right? And then each estate had one vote, only one vote. All those people in the estate had only one vote. And what tended to happen was the first estate and the second estate would always outvote, right, the third estate. So we're going to be looking at this. So within the Ancien regime, we know that we had the first estate, which would be the clergy, right? So the first estate usually consisted of persons that were with the Catholic Church, right? So the priests, the bishops, the abbots, all the other religious figures, right? So members of the clergy had significant religious and political power within the Catholic Church, serving as a central institution in French society, right? The clergy enjoyed privileges and exemption from taxes. That is notable, because if they exempt the taxes from the clergy, then more taxes must go on anybody else who has to pay taxes, right? Contributing to their wealth and influence. The first estate owned vast lands, collected tithes, right, which is 30% of a person's wealth. So they collected the tithes, right, from the peasantry, and played a key role in education, charity, and social welfare. That's the first estate. The second estate now would have been the nobility. The second estate would have been composed of landowners, lords and ladies and aristocrats and members of the royal court. Right? So nobles had hereditary titles, right? So passed down throughout their families, generally from father to son, and enjoyed privileges such as exemption from certain taxes and the right to hold high ranking positions in government, the military, and the church itself. The nobility would traditionally be associated with land ownership and feudal obligations, although their economic and social power varied widely among the different regions and families, right? So, different members of the nobility would have different statuses within the second estate itself, right? So, we had that there. While some nobles were wealthy and influential, others struggled financially and will face challenges maintaining their status and privileges, right? So there were some issues within the second estate as well. The lower second estate and the upper third estates would have formed what we know as the bourgeoisie, and we're gonna look at what happened there within France. The third estate now would have been this encompass a vast majority of the French population, including the peasants, urban workers, artisans, merchants, and generally the bourgeoisie, which we call the middle class, right? So the third estate would have been highly diverse, consists of individuals from various social backgrounds, various economic backgrounds, all over France, right? And they would have faced significant economic hardship, right? Why? Because if the first estate and the third estate have been exempt from taxes, who is going to have to pay the taxes? The third estate would have to pay the taxes, right? There was social inequality, right? As they did not have the right to hold any office, right? Or did not have noble privileges, right? They didn't really have much social rights, right? So it was just really social inequality all over, and particularly in the comparison to the first, well, the privilege of the first and second estates, they really had none, no social status, right? Despite their numerical superiority, the third estate had limited political power and representation, leading to the growing discontent and demands for reform, right? So remember, despite them from having such a large population of the French society, right, they would have only had one vote, along with the one vote from the clergy and the one vote from the nobility, right? So they had limited political power, all right? So the social inequality and the estate system would have been a major issue, right? So within French society, we know that we're divided into the three different estates, and majority of the taxation burden was put onto the third estate, right? So the third estate we know consists of the bourgeoisie, right, which tend to be the skilled workers, right? And a good amount of them were actually educated, and we're going to be looking at how that played a key factor here, right, leading to the growing resentment towards the privileged estates. So the rigid social hierarchy and lack of mobility fueled discontent and contributed to revolutionary fever within the common people. Right, so the depiction here would have looked at the estate system, right, within France, right? So the clergy and the nobility would have been basically riding on the backs, right, of the third estate, who would have to actually pay, right, all the, for all the taxation within France and maintain really everything else within French society, right? The economic hardship and famine. France faced economic challenges in the late 18th century, exacerbated by costly wars, inefficient taxation, and the bargaining of national debt. Right? So, what's basically happening here? What's happening here? The financial hardships of France really stems from the fact that only one estate is being taxed. They lost the Seven Years' War, and they threw a lot of money into helping the Americans with their attempt, right, at independence, right, which the Americans will not repay, right? So we could look at that. There were poor harvests and food shortages at the time in the 1780s, right? So in the 1780s, there were really harsh rather winters, right? So harsh winters would have led to a small amount of harvest, right, that they could have collected. There was a lot of flood, drought specifically, and in some regions of France there were floods, right? They were just terrible. It was just a terrible time really to be living as a peasant within France, right? Because not only do we have to pay for all the taxes or majority of the taxes of the society as the third estate, but you're actually succumbing to famine and starvation because of the harsh effects of the weather at the time, the climate at the time, right? The cost of living was also high, right? So there was a high cost of living and economic instability, further fueling discontent and unrest, right? Creating fertile ground for revolutionary sentiments, right? So not only do I have to take all my money, right, to pay the government, right, but for me to exist as a person, it is expensive for me within France, right? My children can't eat anything because guess what? The ground is ice, right? And we haven't got much harvest this year, right? And everything is just turning upside down within France. So economic grievances were compounded by the perception of corruption and extravagance, right, among the nobility and monarchy, right, leading to calls for reform and accountability. So while the nobles and the clergy were celebrating, especially within elaborate palaces and chateaus. For example, in the Palace of Versailles, right? They were having elaborate parties, right, with foreign officials, right, and within the nobility themselves, right, while the third estate was out suffering throughout French society. So we could have seen that as well. There was also religious and cultural oppression within France. The Catholic Church wielded significant political power. The Catholic Church was a key institution within France specifically. And we know that the clergy would have enjoyed all sorts of privileges, including the exemption from taxation, which would have been spoken about in the economic issues, right? And it exacerbated inequality and resentment for the people. But there were also some amount of issues here. The French Inquisition, right? There were a lot of lynchings and killings for persons and persecution of different religious groups within France that would have also led to some amount of revolutionary sentiment within the people, right? So if you were not Catholic, there was an issue. If you were Protestant, majority of the persons would have been killed, their families thrown out, their villages burned down because simply they believed something slightly different. Technically, they're both Christians, but sorry, you're Protestant, so that was an issue for them, right? So they had to be Catholic, right? So if you were Jewish or from any other religious group, right, you would have been persecuted in some way or another within France, especially if you were a part of the third estate, right? So the church's influence, right, and the perceived corruption of the religious institutions became a target of criticism and reform during the revolution specifically, right? So the Enlightenment principles were one of the issues that challenges the authority of the church, right? When we look at Voltaire, what did Voltaire speak about? Voltaire, right, spoke about, he was a French philosopher, right? He spoke about the separation of church and state, right? And the fact that religious institutions should not have so much power within French society, right? So he spoke about that as well as the freedom of speech, etc. Right? So you guys would have known about Voltaire from Enlightenment principles, right? So the intellectuals, the members of the intelligentsia within the educated bourgeoisie class would have learned about the Enlightenment principles and would have read Voltaire and Rousseau, right? As well, Voltaire and Rousseau and um, John Locke, and would have now looked at French society from a different point of view using these Enlightenment ideas, and that would have also caused some amount of sentiment to brew. But they would have known these Enlightenment ideas, or they would have embodied these Enlightenment ideas, and now when they look at their own society, they tend to be disgusted at it, right? So that would have also increased revolutionary sentiments, right? There was also political oppression and absolutist rule that we looked at. So the monarch, right, under King Louis, right, the 14th, ruled with absolute power, right? That was also a thing that Enlightenment principles warned against, right? The absolutism, right, or what we call religious right to rule, right? So that absolute rule was one of the things that Enlightenment philosophers spoke out against, right? The monarchy's authoritarianism, coupled with a lack of responsiveness rather to the grievances of the people, fueled discontent and revolutionary fever. So all of these different things would have caused some amount of tension. So the Estates General that was convened in 1789 for the first time in over a century. What we're looking at is that the fact that these conditions are getting so much worse, right? The Estates General was called, right, in 1789 here, right? It is not called often, right? It's only called when there is some amount of issue or some amount of problems that France is seeing, and they need to call all the estates together. So the Estates General has not been called for over a century, and highlighted the deep divisions and frustrations within French society. Because when the Estates General is called, we know that there's an issue, right? And there was a failure of attempts at reformation, right? So there was some amount of issues here. There was a deadlock within the Estates General. As we said, right, the first estate had one vote, the second estate had one vote, and the third estate had one vote, right? But if the third estate is going to push for reform and to push for the fact that the first estate and the second estate must also carry the burden of taxation, obviously the first and the second estate will not agree to these terms and will vote against it. 2 against 1, right? So there was a complete deadlock within the Estates General, and that will further erode the confidence of the French people in the French monarchy. So these are the major issues that we saw within French Revolution, right? So now we're starting to look at the French Revolutionary concepts, right? Liberty, equality, fraternity, right? So the French Revolution championed the ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity, which are encapsulated within their slogan here, right? So these principles served as rallying cries for the revolutionaries and encapsulated the core values and aspirations of the revolutionary movement, right? They wanted some amount of freedom. They wanted equality and the disassemblement, right? Or disestablishment of the entire ancient regime so that all estates could be somewhat equal, right? We're looking at those stuff, right? And we're looking at solidarity and unity and brotherhood among citizens. So this slide is just really looking at and analyzing that phrase there, right? So I'm not sure if you guys want to just like probably take a snapshot of this, because this is just really talking about the phrase liberty, equality, and fraternity. All right. So the causes are somewhat done at this point, and now we're going to be looking at the revolution itself, right? So the revolution is going to be taking shape. So let's look at the course of the French Revolution, right? So the pre-revolutionary period in 1789 would have looked at this, right? There was economic hardship, social inequality, political discontent in France, right? And we know with the monarchy specifically, right? King Louis XIV really summoned the Estates General and to assess that really detrimental financial crisis that was happening within France at the time, right? And that never worked out because all the first and second estate would have done, right, or did was just vote against the third estate, not leading to any type of reform at all, and that just led to more upheaval, right? And then we have now the third estate now representing the commoners broke away from the Estates General and signaling defiance against the monarchy, right? So they started to break away from the monarchy itself, and here's where we see the start of the revolutionary period, right? On July 14th, 1789, we saw one of the first real acts of revolution within France with the storming of the Bastille, right? So the Bastille was basically just a fortress, right, and a state prison in Paris, seen as a symbol of oppression, right? So on this July the 14th of 1789, a large crowd of the revolutionaries in Paris, the Parisian revolutionaries, would have well been emboldened by the economic hardship and political repression, right? And dismal of Jack Necker, right? So that was one of the popular ministers, right? One of the major persons, one of the important personalities that would see in Paris that was actually against revolution, right? So it was one of the major revolutionaries, right? Um, Persons would have been named after him, the Jacobins, right? Would look at that in the future, right? They would actually storm the Bastille. So what they did was basically take up whatever crude weapons they could, right? Formed angry mobs and actually stormed the Bastille, right? Entering the prison, right? Killing some of the soldiers specifically, right? And really starting the revolution itself, right? This is where the revolution itself kicked off, right? So looking at this now, Storming of the Bastille is really celebrated in France as a national day, Bastille Day, commemorating the birth of the French Republic, right? And ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity, right? So this is where we have the start of the revolution, and it is honestly one of the most important things you could mention about the course of the French Revolution, right? I'm just mentioning key events within the revolution, right? We had the Women's March on Versailles, October the same year, right? So the Women's March on Versailles really sparked by bread shortages, right? And rising food prices, exacerbated by economic hardships and inequality, right? So what we're looking at here is that thousands of women, right, would have stormed the streets specifically and marched towards this palace at Versailles, right? And this is where King Louis XIV and Queen Marie Antoinette would have been staying at the time specifically, right? The marches were motivated by the frustration with the monarchy and resentment towards Marie Antoinette, right? So Marie specifically was one of these persons who would have thrown a lot of extravagant balls, extravagant parties, right? She wanted all the best things in high society and life, right? And most notably, she was not French. So that was another issue that they had there, right? With their queen not being French. They had an issue with it from the beginning, right? So we had that there, right? So they desired some amount of social and economic justice. And upon reaching Versailles, the crowd confronted the king and queen, demanding action to alleviate the suffering and calling for the royal family to return to Paris, right? So they were in Versailles at the time. They were calling for them to return to Paris and now deal with these issues of the shortages, right? So we have these issues now. The king actually actually gave in to the commands of the crowd, really agreeing to relocate to Paris, right? With the National Assembly, um, effectively ending the monarch's isolation from the people and bringing them closer to the heart of the revolution, right? So while the monarchs are over there in Versailles, chilling, having the best time of their lives, right? The people urge for them to come back to Paris now and actually do something about the issues, right? So they moved eventually back to Paris in that case, right? The National Assembly and the French Rights of Man, right? We saw the National Assembly being brought out between 1789 and 1791, right? The National Assembly adopted the Tennis Court Oath, pledging to draw a new constitution for France. So basically, what happened within this case, right? We had the entire Estates General issue, right, from before, right? And the third estate was really tired of really speaking to the first and second estate and the monarchy that was really not listening to them at all. They were not taking into consideration anything. So they stormed out of the Estates General. They stormed out of the actual French assembly, right? And they found a place to actually come together, right? So they can actually have some amount of discussions, right? And this took place within that tennis court, right? So that's why it's called the tennis court oath, right? Pledging to draw a new constitution in France, right? And in July 14th, 1789, as was stated, right, the persons would have stormed the Bastille, symbolizing a breakaway from the French monarchy and some amount of revolt against country, symbolizing the start of the revolts and revolutions, right? The National Assembly would have issued the Declarations of Rights of Man as well, of the citizen, right? Proclaiming principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity. And the monarchy was gradually stripped of its power, and the constitutional monarchy was established, right? With Louis XIV as the figurehead. So this was happening, right? So it was similar to what happened with the Golden Revolution in Britain, right? It never happened this way in Britain, but with the establishment of a constitutional monarchy, and unfortunately in this way in France, this was the establishment of their constitutional monarchy and the French Republic, right? The National Assembly was really radical at the time, right? Because the National Assembly actually passed a lot of rights that also applied to the French colonies, giving independence to Saint-Domingue, right? In 1790. This is 1790 or 1791, somewhere around there, right? I think you guys should look for the date there. But Saint-Domingue and the French territories within the Caribbean all got independence within the 1700s, right? It would have been short-lived, right? And the colonies would actually not do anything about it, right? But they technically got independence from the National Assembly in that case. But the Legislative Assembly from 1791 to 1792 now, the Legislative Assembly would have actually replaced the National Assembly, introducing new reforms and debating the future direction of the revolution, right? So they wanted to figure out where are we going to go, right? So we're gonna have the Girondins, which are spoke about as the moderate Republicans, right, and the Jacobins were the radical revolutionaries, right. So we have the evolution now of two different political factions, two different well, we call them factions and technically not parties, but they're two different political factions, right. One of them who were the moderate Republicans, they just wanted the constitutional monarchy and they wanted Louis XIV to stay on the throne and they wanted all the issues to be alleviated. But the Jacobins, however, no, right, were actually persons who wanted the complete radicalization of the revolution, right, the complete removal of the monarchy and establishment of a perfect republic, right? So they were way more radical than their counterparts, right? So in this case now, right, France declared war on Austria and Prussia in April of 1792, leading to military stepbacks and internal unrest, right? So why was this done, right? Austria and Prussia and many of the persons, many of the neighboring monarchies within Europe at the time felt truly unsafe by France, right? Because what we're looking at is a radical change. At the time, for centuries, monarchies really stood within Europe. And we're looking at the fact that if France, which was literally one of the most powerful nations at the time, could actually be broken down through revolution and their king be reduced so much to just a figurehead, they were looking at the fact that France, what was happening, France could have actually spilled over into their countries and radicalized their own people. So Austria and Prussia actually now was looking towards France to actually invade and actually stop the entire revolutionary process so they could maintain power over their citizens, right? They don't want the citizens within Europe to see the fact that monarchy can actually be destroyed, monarchy can be defeated, right? So one of the major thinking principles of Austria and Prussia and other neighbors surrounding France would have been to stop revolutionary France, right? And restore the monarchy there. So that was one of the reasons why France would have declared war on Austria and Prussia to defend its interests and to defend the French people overall, right? So the symbolism and the end of monarchy, specifically the execution of Louis XIV on January 21, 1793, would have marked the end of centuries of absolute monarchy in France, right? It symbolized the triumph of revolutionary ideals and republicanism and popular sovereignty over the old regime, right? So by putting the king on trial and executing him, the revolutionaries really rejected the divine right of kings, right? Saying that God gave him the right to rule over the commoners. They were completely rejected that notion, right? Of the divine right as well as absolute authority vested in a single individual, right? So this act now reaffirmed the principle of political power, right? Of well, that political power should actually derive from the people itself, from the people governed, right? So here we're seeing these principles that we take for granted today, right? So today we know that the government is there for making good decisions and laws for the people, right? That's what they ought to do, right? And these principles were really set out by in the Declaration of Rights of Man, right, in France, right, at the end of its monarchy. So what's happening here is that there are major changes. For centuries, these institutions have stood, right? And within the span of a couple of years, the French have overturned them all. So this is a true revolution here, right? So drastic change in political, economic, or social institutions within a country. That is generally what a revolution is, and we're seeing drastic change in political and social institutions, right? Well, the polarization of political factors as well, right? The execution of the king deepened political divisions in revolutionary France, right? Because we have the Girondins and the Jacobins, right? So the Girondins actually favored, right? They actually favored a more conservative approach to governance, right? Allowing the king to live as a figurehead, but the Jacobins didn't want that, right? So based on the execution of the king now, that really polarized the entire revolution within France, right? So it galvanized more counter-revolutionary sentiments among royalists and conservatives, right? So now after the king was executed, within France, a lot of enemies to the revolution started to actually pop up, right? And this led to more instability and violence, descending France into what we call the Reign of Terror, right? So here we're gonna see the radicalization of the revolution per se, right? As we see leading figures like Maximilian Robespierre would have implemented all different types of radical policies to suppress dissent to a greater with greater severity. We started to execute all enemies of the revolution or any persons who were seen to actually support the royalists or support the king. They started to execute all of them to started that basically started an entire what we call the reign of terror there, right? So anybody who was not radical enough or anybody who was not Jacobin enough, right, would have been an enemy or would have been seen as an enemy to the revolution, right? And that would have caused a complete period of complete chaos and violence and terror within France, right? So we had that there with the National Convention, the Reign of Terror from 1792 lasting till 1794. So the National Convention abolished the monarchy and established the first French Republic in September of 1792. Right? So we have that there, right? The Girondins, right, who were the moderates, right? They were ousted from power and replaced with the radical Jacobins led by Maximilian Robespierre, who gained control. And he really was one of the main proponents of the Reign of Terror, right? So he marked by this reign, right, was marked by mass executions of perceived enemies of the revolution, including nobles, clergy, and political rivals, right? So not only was he executing the nobles, right, and religious individuals who were seen as corrupt, right, that would have been somewhat okay with some persons. So from some perspectives, I'm sure some of you guys would have probably agreed with them removing enemies of the revolution itself. But after a while, he started to just actually execute political rivals as well. So anybody who would rival him in actually leading the National Convention. So he started executing anybody who he saw as a threat, right? And this was generally through guillotine. So Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety wielded dictatorial power, implementing revolutionary measures and suppressing any form of dissent. So any type of dissent, any type of, if they even look at you and you look like you were supporting the royalists, right, or not supporting the revolution, you'd have been seen as an enemy of the state and would have been executed, right? So there were a couple of years of just total violence within France, right? And that is why we call it the Reign of Terror. Okay. Now, after this, now, right, in 1795 to around 1799, we have the fall of Robespierre and the end of the Reign of Terror, which led to a period of instability and political realignment in France, right? The Directory, a moderate Republican government, so this is a form of government or a type of government which they call the Directory, was established, but it struggled to govern effectively amid economic turmoil and internal strife. Right, so due to all the instability caused by the Reign of Terror, right, they instituted this government and it found many issues with trying to actually regain stability in France. Right, France also faced external threats from European coalitions, as many monarchies across Europe banded together to destroy the revolution in France in attempts to stop revolutions from spurring up within their countries. Right, so the coalition was really there, which also created some amount of issues for France because we now saw that there were enemies at its doorstep, and we also had internal challenges with the royalists versus radical elements, right? So there was always still that polarization in the revolution, right? And this allowed the rise of military leaders like Napoleon Bonaparte, right? It's really signaled the eventual demise of the Directory and the transition into the Napoleonic era, right? So, in this type of dictatorial society, right, it really allowed for military officials to reach positions of power, and Napoleon became the consul of France, right, leading France there. So that would be the start of the Napoleonic era and the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon would have actually gone on to be one of the greatest generals in history, defeating all European enemies, right? But eventually succumbing to defeat, right, and exile. But we're not going into the Napoleonic era. This is where Cape History wants us to stop at the beginning of the Napoleonic era, right? So what were the impacts of this revolution per se? Well, political effects, right? The French Revolution led to the overthrow of the monarchy and establishment of the First French Republic, right? It also abolished the feudal privileges and centralized authority and introduced democratic principles. So that's one of the first things. It changed the type of government from a monarchy to a republic. The revolution also witnessed the rise and falls of various political factions, right? So we had also the juggling of different political factions, each vying for shaping the direction of the revolution per se. And the revolution also saw the implementation of radical measures such as the Reign of Terror and the Committee of Public Safety, right? And the establishment of the Directory, reflecting tumultuous and volatile natures of the revolutionary politics, right? So every basic, I mean, this is a hyperbolic, right? This is hyperbolic. I'm just saying this, right? That like every other year there was a change in the government, right? The government changed, right? So if you see the government of a country constantly changing like that, you'd know that is a very unstable nature to it, right? So it was really unstable at first before we actually had the rise of one key figure, who was Napoleon, who could lead the new French Republic, right, to political stability. Where the ideological effects now, the French Revolution popularized Enlightenment ideals such as liberty, equality, and fraternity, which became central tenets of revolutionary ideologies and republican governance, right? So notice now, the United States of America is a republic, right? Only a republic for which it stands, right? It's a republican form of governance, so it takes in a lot of Enlightenment ideals, right? And these revolutionary ideologies would actually spread far outside of France. So the revolutionary rhetoric and propaganda spread revolutionary ideals across Europe and beyond, inspiring other nationalist and revolutionaries, right, movements, and challenging the legitimacy and traditional authority within multiple different regions, right? So this establishment of this document, right, by Thomas Paine, right, would have been one of the integral works of literature that would actually spread throughout the world and cause the descent of monarchies, right? Social effects now. We know that we have the abolishment of the ancien regime. So we're going to look at the fact that the estate system is now gone and there's a redistribution of land and erosion of traditional hierarchies, right? So there is no nobility, there is no peasant or or anything like that, right? We're gonna have an equal redistribution of land, more or less, not completely equal, but we're gonna have more or less, right? And now there's gonna be equal taxation. The revolution empowered previous marginalized groups such as the bourgeoisies and urban workers, right, while sparking resistance and backlash from conservatives and royalists, right? So what's happening here now is that there's a growth of the middle class, right? The middle class now is able to, serve as members of parliament, right? Serving parliamentary settings, right? They are able to now do things that they once couldn't. The nobility are people who once were seen as noble now had to pay taxes. Now, the royalists would obviously have an issue with this, right? Right? So they would have issues with these redistribution of social burdens, right? The revolution also had mixed effects on women's rights, as it inspired calls for gender equality and political participation, but ultimately fell short of achieving sustainable reforms in this area, right? So I'm not sure if anybody is really interested in history, right, or law or anything like that. But after the French Revolution, once you move on and look at what was happening within Europe at the time, this would be the main beginning of radicalist feminism, as feminism would now spark across Europe after monarchy's fall. Right? So now there's a right of man, and now women started to look at the fact that okay, right, you don't have to be a man to be able to vote, etc. Right? So there's gonna be a lot of women's movements across Europe, which lead to the feminist movements, right, of the 20th century, right? So we won't look at that in history too, but something to look at there. We also have the economic effects, right? So the French Revolution had profound economic consequences, leading to different financial systems, and we had actually the growth of the economy after there's a reconstruction of the taxation system, right? So now everybody had to pay some amount of taxes. Churches no longer had complete control over land. Land was now nationalized and given back to the people. The introduction of a paper currency was also instituted, right? So we know that war would always cause some amount of economic instability, right? So there's some inflation exacerbated by the revolutionary turmoil, war, and social upheaval, leading to hardship and hardship for many, right, across France itself, contributing to social unrest and political radicalization, right? So you're gonna still have some radicals within France in around 1794, right, 1795, around those areas after the revolution, who would push towards more radicalist economic reforms and social reforms to better the French situation, right? The impact on the Caribbean is one thing that we must look at, right? So the French Revolution had a significant impact on the Caribbean, particularly in French colonies, colonial positions such as Saint Domingue, right? Where the revolutionary ideas of liberty and equality inspired enslaved Africans and free people of color to demand their rights and resist colonial oppression, right? That's one of the key things that we must look at. The French Revolution is a turning point in history, right? The French Revolution sparked ideas, right, and ideals that would span for generations, and the same ideas that the French people were fighting for at this period in history are the same ideas that we all have today, right? All of those rights and responsibilities that you learn in social studies and sociology, right, and that is a part of our constitution, all of these things were meted out within the American War of Independence and the French Revolution. This is where these ideas come from, right? So after the French Revolution, it caused the revolution within Saint-Domingue, the Haitian Revolution as we know it, and the Haitian Revolution would have sparked the revolts in Grenada of that year and the revolts in Guadeloupe of that year, and it will spark the Bossa Revolt and the revolts of the Jamaicans, right, within the Baptist Wars. It will spark revolutions all across the world, right? So the beginning of the revolutions in the Caribbean and Latin America was can be attributed somewhat to the French revolutionary ideas that will embolden their want for emancipation and freedom. Right? So not only do they have these issues with enslavement or issues with political inferiority in the case of Latin American states, right? They would now be armed with Enlightenment principles and the Declaration of Rights of Man from the French Revolution, right? Then we have the impact of on European monarchies specifically, right? That we'll just briefly look at. The execution of the reigning monarch shocked um, and alarmed other European monarchies, right? So if we look at Catherine the Great and all the other monarchs and queens and kings across Europe, they were all on the edge of their seats, right, when they were looking at what was happening within France per se. It fueled fears of, a revolutionary um, contagion, right, or a revolutionary force, right, that promoted European powers to intervene militarily in France, right? So they actually wanted to end the revolution in France and to put King Louis XIV back on the throne, but that did not happen there, right? So the execution of the king, the abolition of the monarchy, actually allowed for persons to look on to France, right? And then to now examine their own situation, leading to monarchies falling across Europe, right? Majority of them were not actual complete destructions of their monarchies, but the creation of parliamentary monarchies, right? Similar to that was in Britain at the time, right? So the monarchy, as it was known within Europe at this time, right, was now completely shifted, and the concept turned on its head after the French Revolution, right? The impact on the wider world, we discussed this briefly already, right? So the ideas of nationalism and liberalism and democracy would have spread throughout the world as the world looks on at France and the revolutionary changes that benefited the lesser people or the commoners, right? So people really looked at France. People really took the ideas of the French Revolution, took it to their own countries, and made their own contributions to relieving the middle class from the strains of absolutism, right? So that's really it for the French Revolution.